Are the New York Giants on the right track? Is Eli Manning a first ballot Hall of Famer? We've got all that plus a walk down memory lane with former New York sports writer Gary Myers, a Hall of Fame voter and published author. That's coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. All right, we're going to go in 3, 2, 1. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credentialed member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI. You can find our written work over at si.com/NFL/Giants. Welcome on in to my everydayers, my Blue Crew community members, my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's podcast, I'm very, very honored to have a special guest with me. He is Gary Myers, former New York Daily News columnist, actually longtime columnist. He's been around a long time. He's also a published author of a book. His latest book is Once a Giant, A Story of Victory, Tragedy, and Life After Football. He's also a Hall of Fame voter, and we're going to talk Giants. We're going to talk a little bit about Eli Manning's Hall of Fame chances, and then we're going to talk about Gary's book because there's some really good stuff in there. If you are into Giants history, this is a book you have to pick up. So, Gary, welcome on into the program.
Hi, Patty. How you doing?
Doing well. Glad to see you. It's been a while, but we're here and we're having this chance to talk, so I'm glad to have you.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Gary, let's jump in here and start off talking about the Giants. Now, it's been kind of a weird unfolding of the Brian Daboll, Joe Schoen era. They came out of the gate and surprised a lot of people. 9-7-1, went to the playoffs, won their first postseason game since 2011. Then last year, the bottom fell out, and everybody was pointing fingers at Daniel Jones, the injuries, the offensive line, this, that, and the other thing. When you look at the way the team unfolded from 2022 to 2023, and I'm not saying that those factors weren't part of it, but do you think maybe that the 2022 team was overhyped? Or did it maybe create a false sense of hope moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting issue, Patty. It's almost if they had got the season, it's almost like they got the seasons flip-flopped. If 2022 had the same results as 23 and 23 had the results of 22, then you'd say, well, the arrow is pointing up, that Daniel Jones looks like he's turned the corner. Daboll's a great coach. Joe Schoen knows what he's doing. All positive stuff that was coming out of the 22 season. Daboll was the coach of the year. But because, initially we would have thought the first season in 22 would have looked like happened in the second year, all the negativity poured in. And all the reasons you gave for the Giants' downturn are accurate. But also, for Giant fans and the organization, also incredibly disappointing, which has now raised questions about Daniel Jones. And, the Giants very much want to take a quarterback in the first round of the draft this year. It's raised questions about Daboll, who lost what appears to be like half his staff. It's not quite that many in the offseason, including Wink Martindale. And there's been questions about, his sideline demeanor and how he deals with his coaches. So all the questions that have come up after the 23 season are legitimate. It's just for the long-term future of the franchise, it would have been better if the two seasons were flip-flopped.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting start, as you said. But that being said, with all the questions that have come up, can this team, do you think, overcome them? Or are they still legitimate, lingering questions that might get in the way of the team taking the next step?
Well, I think, this current administration needs some time. And, the 22 season did create unrealistic expectations for 23. But let's remember, they were 9-7-1. It wasn't like they were 11-6. And what I think people have tended to overlook was, okay, they won a playoff game in Minnesota against a very poor defensive team, and maybe the real Giants and the real Daniel Jones showed up the next week in Philadelphia, where they, were overwhelmed by the Eagles. So this is now the third year of the program. Shane has had 3 drafts, 3 cracks at free agency. This is in a normal progression. This is the year that you expect to see, major improvement. Will it happen? I mean, it's impossible to tell. We didn't think they would go 9-7-1 in 22, and we didn't think they were going to go 6-11 in 23. So it's really hard to predict. But the talent on the roster is getting better, and whether that results in more than the 6 victories or more than 9 victories, we'll have to see. A lot of it will depend on injuries, and a lot of it certainly will depend on which version of Daniel Jones are we going to see this year.
A lot of people said that Saquon Barkley was really the driving force of the offense, with Daniel Jones at quarterback, in that 2022 season. Now, of course, Saquon is no longer on the team, having gone to the Eagles. So that being said, how much do you think that loss is going to hurt the Giants, or do you think Daniel Jones and that offense can overcome it?
Well, Patty, I mean, it depends. I mean, Saquon was always hurt, it seemed like. And when he was healthy, he was by far the best player on the offense, the only one that defensive coordinators had a game plan against. But for how many games really in his year, was it 5 years that he was here? Is that what it was? Was it 5 years or 6? I lose track.
It was 6, 2018.
Okay, you're right. Did the Giants really? How many games during that period of time did the Giants really have a competent offense that you say, okay, having Saquon is such a bonus, because with all the other weapons around him, you don't know who to double on the outside, and how many defenders do you have assigned to watching Barkley. I mean, it was just a small stretch there, I think, towards the end of the 22 season, and in that playoff game against Minnesota, that you'd say, okay, Barkley looks like a Hall of Fame player. I mean, out of 6 years, all those games that he missed and then the games that he was there for, there just weren't enough that you'd say that the guy is an irreplaceable part. And the way the NFL is going these days, where the money is not being allocated to running backs, I understand that he's not the missing piece like McCaffrey was with San Francisco. I don't think the team is good enough right now to say, okay, we can spend $13 or $14 million a year on a running back. And that isn't necessarily a knock on Barkley as much as it is a knock on where the Giants are at, that they can probably get sufficient production out of Devin Singletary and some of the other guys that they have at running back this year. And then when they build up the rest of the team, it might be time to go out and spend either in the draft or free agency on a back that's going to really scare defenses.
There's been talk that Brian Daboll may take over the play calling this year. I mean, he's been doing it in the spring, and it sure looks like it's pointing that way. Do you sense that as almost like a sign of desperation to make that change at this point, or is that just a matter of, look, we got to do something to shake things up?
Well, realistically, the Giants hired Daboll because of the offensive work he did in Buffalo with Josh Allen, and because he was a really creative play caller. And this is a dilemma that so many coaches face when they're coordinators, regardless of which side of the ball. And then they get a head coaching job and they go, okay, let's delegate and just be the CEO of the operation. Well, in doing that, they take a step back from what they do best. And unless they've hired somebody that they have complete faith in, that is doing the things to get the offense or the defense rolling, depending, who is the head coach, then you're always going to have questions. Well, would the head coach be better off doing it himself? Ideally, you'd like the head coach to be a Parcells type, in that he is in charge of game management. He's in charge of coaching the coaches. He's in charge of, motivating them and and that kind of stuff. And he can delegate like Parcells did with Belichick and Ron Earhart. But it doesn't always work out that way. And you find a lot of coaches who have a specialty on one side of the ball and things aren't going exactly the way they planned for a couple of years, that they'll take back the play calling and what they do best. Mike McCarthy, did that in Dallas, and they put up big numbers last year, but then failed in the playoffs. So I don't think I don't know enough about Mike Kafka and if he deserves the blame, if his play calling hasn't been creative enough. I don't think he's had a lot of material to work with offensively, but I think there is pressure on Daboll to win this year. I think that is real. And if he's going to fail, he might as well fail being in charge of what he does best. So it's not a good reflection on Kafka if Daboll decides to take back the play calling, and maybe Mike wouldn't have taken the job here in the first place if he didn't think he was going to play a play caller, and he's had other opportunities since he's here that they blocked him from. But Daboll's got to make the decision that's best, not only for himself, which is probably secondary, but make the decision that's best for the team. And if calling the plays is going to be the most productive way for the Giants to get this offense on track, then yeah, I would endorse that.
Gary, they drafted Malik Neighbors in the first round after reportedly trying to trade up to get a quarterback. So it's, running it back with Daniel Jones and pretty much the offenses is Daniel Jones salvageable? I mean, he had a good year, obviously 2022, not a great year, but probably his best
touchdown passes.
Yeah, probably his best year since his rookie campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But is he salvageable at this point, you think?
Well, I think it comes down to, a few things. One is his confidence. What's his confidence like right now? After, he wasn't playing well before he got hurt last year, before he re-injured his neck, and then before he had the ACL. He still wasn't playing well. How much of that was the offensive line? We saw what happened in the season opener against Dallas. They moved down the field the first time they had the ball, and that was pretty much for the offense for the rest of the season. And they didn't score on that drive against Dallas, by the way. Can he stay healthy? I mean, obviously that's a given that he has to stay healthy. Is the talent around him better? Well, Malik Neighbors, if he turns out to be Jamar Chase, then yeah, obviously they've upgraded tremendously. I've seen enough, and they call it flashes. I mean, it's become an overused expression. I've seen enough flashes from Daniel Jones over, his career to think that if he can put it together, all the good stuff I've seen, if he can become consistent in doing that, throwing the ball, he has good arm strength, throwing it with accuracy. He's a great athlete, as we've seen, and they have to be able to use his legs. Maybe they're hesitant to do that because of the neck injuries. So we're going to find out, how much a part of the game plan his running ability is going to be. And I think it's important for him to be an effective quarterback, for him to run the ball just because of who he is. And he's not going to really scare anybody with their arm, but the total package can be effective. I mean, he played great in that Minnesota playoff game. Is there more of that inside of him? It makes you wonder if the Giants feel there is, because Drake May was the quarterback you referenced. They tried to trade up to get him. Personally, I think that J.J. McCarthy is going to be the best quarterback to come out of this draft. Now, I will admit that I'm prejudiced in that regard because my son is a Michigan grad from a few years ago, and I became a big Michigan follower, and I saw every snap that J.J. McCarthy played in his 2 years starting for Michigan. And I think he's going to be terrific. That he didn't have the big numbers in college because that's not the way Jim Harbaugh wanted to play, but it doesn't mean he can't do it. And I think the Giants should have just stayed put at number 6 as they did. And instead of taking Neighbors, I think they should have taken J.J. McCarthy, because now the whole season is predicated on Daniel Jones. And certainly I think the organization has their doubts about him because, like I said, if they were all in on Daniel Jones, they wouldn't have tried to trade up for Drake May.
Yeah, exactly. Gary, I want to ask you about the defense real quick before we pivot to another topic. Shane Bowen, the new defensive coordinator, runs a completely different system than what Wink Martindale ran. Wink, of course, was known for bringing the pressure, living and dying by the blitz. Shane Bowen is more of a get after the quarterback with the front seven and whatnot. How much do you think of a step back is this going to be for the Giants defense? Given that, the last couple of years they built up the personnel to suit what Wink wanted, and now they've got Bowen who maybe wants something a little bit different in his players.
Well, anytime you change coordinators and change systems, it's an adjustment. But I mean, that's why you have the off season. That's why you have training camp. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. Wink played. I mean, I saw Wink's defense with the Jets all those years that Rex was the head coach. That it's high risk, high reward, but also can be really hurtful if you don't get to the quarterback. And I think it'll be fine. And clearly, Dable and Martindale had their differences, whether it was philosophical, personality, or whatever it was. It wasn't working. And I'm not sure. I mean, I really don't know Wink to know whether he would prefer to stay in the NFL or he wound up at Michigan, where his two predecessors were actually his proteges. So he's putting in the same defense in Michigan that they've had. So that's probably a good fit for him. I like the Giants signing, trade for Brian Burns. He's an elite pass rusher, and I think it'll make things easier for Thibodeau on the other side. Maybe he won't see as many double teams, and you got to have two, and you got to be able to put pressure on the quarterback the way the NFL is structured now. So I think the Giants defense, they improved the secondary in the draft, used a couple of high draft picks on defensive backs. Whether it's all going to happen this year, we'll have to see how the young guys play.
All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up with Gary Myers, author, Hall of Fame voter, former New York sports writer. Don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, with the dead period coming up in the NFL calendar, I'm really looking forward to catching some shows and concerts in the area. And no matter what event I end up choosing, I never have to worry about getting tickets thanks to Game Time. With Game Time, there are always great seats available at competitive prices. They even offer last-minute money-saving deals, and they take away the guesswork as far as fees, seat views, and other aspects that can make ticket buying a nightmare. Game Time even offers event cancellation protection, and if you find tickets elsewhere in the same section and row for less, Game Time will give you 110% of the difference. So go on and get the event tickets you've been wanting. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Terms apply. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and my special guest today is Gary Myers. Gary's got a fairly new book out, Once a Giant, a story of victory, tragedy, and life after football. We're going to talk about that a little later on in the program, but I want to talk now, Gary, about the league in general and also about Eli Manning's Hall of Fame chances. Now, you are a voting member of the Hall of Fame panel. There's already debate going on. Eli is going to be eligible for the Hall of Fame this coming year, but there's already debate as to whether or not he is a first ballot Hall of Famer. Where do you stand on that?
I look at it like this. Eli won 2 Super Bowls. He won 2 Super Bowl MVPs. In each of those Super Bowls against the Patriots, he led game-winning drives in the last 2 minutes. The first time against a team that was 2 minutes away from being remembered as the greatest single-season team in NFL history. So I want to know, how else do you judge a Hall of Fame quarterback other than in the biggest moments that he was placed in his career against a team that could have been the greatest of all time, and then the second time they played the Patriots was still a very good team. And he goes right down the field, each time with a memorable throw. Now, the Tyreek catch was more known as the catch, for the catch. But, those of us who were there and remember, like you, Patty, he did an amazing job escaping the Patriots rush on that play and stepping back and making that throw. Tyree made an amazing catch, but then Eli finished off the drive with the touchdown to Plexico. He made an amazing throw to Mario Manningham on the winning drive, the second Super Bowl against the Patriots. Now, the Manning detractors, and I have to tell you, I think there's going to be many in that room, point to Eli having a 500 record. And, was he an elite quarterback? Well, I just look at some of the other players that are in there. Warren Moon never got to a Super Bowl. His numbers are, to me, a product of longevity rather than excellence. I mean, he played probably about 4 or 5 years longer than he was really worthy of being a starter, in my opinion. And I like Warren a lot. And I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to be in. But if Warren Moon's in the Hall of Fame, then Eli Manning has to be in the Hall of Fame. And, Kurt Warner, and I did vote for Kurt, but he's got a big donut in the middle of his career. I mean, he was great at the beginning, first 3 years with the Rams, and he was terrific at the end with the Cardinals and got him to a Super Bowl, which is what got him in the Hall of Fame, was that second. It was his third Super Bowl, but with the second team. But I just don't see how those guys are in the Hall of Fame and Eli is not. And the question I'm going to ask in the meeting room is, would Dan Marino switch careers with Eli Manning? And I think it's a really intriguing question. Dan has incredible numbers. He got to a Super Bowl his second year in the NFL and lost by a lot and never got back. So it was all the numbers he accumulated, and having the reputation as probably a top 5 quarterback in NFL history. Would you trade that for 2 Super Bowls? I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, people might disagree with me. So this is my long way of saying is yes, I'm going to definitely be a proponent and advocate for Eli. The process probably starts around September, Patty, where we'll get a list of about 150 eligible players. And then we immediately will vote it down to 25. And then the next vote down is to 15. And when we get to 15, those are the players who are considered the finalists that we'll then discuss in our meeting in January. And from 15, we voted from 10. This is all in the same meeting. From 10, we voted to 5. And then when you get to 5, you need 80% of the 50 votes in the room to be selected. And Eli's not one of those guys like his brother and like Tom Brady will be, and Deion Sanders and Jerry Rice and Joe Montana, where the presenter just stands up, says the name, and sits down. There'll be, without even making a presentation, there'll be a presentation made. Bob Glauber will probably do it because he does the Giant presentations and I do the Jet presentations. But after Bob speaks, I'm certainly going to make my own presentation on Eli, and I think he's deserving of getting in the first time, whether it happens or not. We here in New York who saw, I saw almost every game he played. I saw enough great things, and I think the Giants really let him down the second half of his career by not giving him an offensive line, and other than Odell, really not giving him a receiver that defenses really had to worry about.
Along with Eli, there's also a question of Tom Coughlin's worthiness for the Hall of Fame. I think it would be really neat if both of them went into the Hall of Fame together. I don't know that it'll happen, but what are your thoughts about Coughlin's candidacy for the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, see, now that's in the coach contributor category. And the way it works, there's 12 members of the coach contributor category. There's 12 members of the senior category, and all those voters are still part of the 50. I'm on the senior committee, so I don't have a vote when they decide on the coach contributor. I don't have a vote until they decide who the finalist is, and then we all voted on it in January. If I did have a vote, I think my priority list in that category would probably start with Robert Kraft for what he's done with that franchise, getting to 10 Super Bowls, 9 with Brady and Belichick, winning 6 of them. And the work he's done, which to average NFL fans is behind the scenes, but with the TV contract and a lot of financial things, I think he's definitely a Hall of Famer. If Jerry Jones is a Hall of Famer and Eddie DeBartolo is a Hall of Famer, I think Robert Kraft is as well. Now, that being said, I think you have Coughlin, Shanahan, and Mike Holmgren. I might be forgetting somebody there. Dan Reeves, who would be in the group of coaches one of them should be next up among the coaches to be selected. And I would say Tom has as strong a chance as any of those four. Again, because I'm not going to be on that committee and being part of the discussion when they knock that group down to the one, because there's only one that comes out of that group. There's 3 seniors, and that could change. I think this might be the last year that we do the 3-1, and I think there might have been some talk about splitting up the coach and contributor category and giving one to each or one every other year, which is how they used to have it. So there could be some changes after this year, but yeah, I think for the work that Tom did in Jacksonville, and that gets overshadowed a little bit because we think of him more about, especially in this part of the country, we think of him more about what he did with the Giants. He got to 2 championship games with an expansion team. One of them in the second year of the franchise, which is amazing. And then he comes to New York and wins 2 Super Bowls. So no doubt Tom has a Hall of Fame resume. And whether or not it would be really cool for them to go into the Hall, for Tom and Eli to go in together. I would say the chances of that happening in the same year is probably a long shot, because I think the chances of Eli getting in this year are much better than Tom, simply because I think that Kraft might be the next one up from that category. But that's just kind of an educated guess because I'm not on that committee.
Right. Makes sense, certainly. Gary, I want to ask you about the changes that have been proposed and have been made on the game over the years. It just seems like, Roger Goodell talks about player safety, but yet now we've got games just about every day of the week. We've got international games. Now they're talking about eliminating OTAs and making training camp, longer. I mean, you like myself, we were around back in the day when there were 2 days in training camp practice, when the preseason was 6 weeks long. Actually, there were 6 preseason games. It was a little longer. What are your thoughts about some of the changes and the direction that this game is taking?
Yeah, the change in training camp, I think, is proposed by the Players Association to start the off-season program either I think it was mid to late June. So that's not an owner-driven one, and I'm not even sure the players would be in favor of that. As far as the other changes, in the 2011 collective bargaining agreement, they got rid of 2 days in training camp. They limited the number of days in pads in practice during the regular season. I mean, you don't have to go back that far to remember there were 2 days in pads in training camp, 15 years ago. I mean, Parcells, it was brutal watching some of this stuff. 2 days, 3-4 days in a row. Not that Bill was doing anything different than anybody else. Those were the rules. You were allowed to do it. Bill Walsh was the only one who I thought, I remember when I was in Dallas, Tony Hill was one of the Cowboys who I covered. And then he went to the 49ers towards the end of his career. So I went out to 49ers training camp to do a story on him. And he goes, man, you can't believe it out here. Instead of the afternoon practice, Bill Walsh told us to go swimming in the pool on campus. He goes, this is great out here. Landry used to practice us twice a day hard, in hard practices. Coaches like Parcells, I just don't think would be able to do it these days. Belichick made the adjustment. I'm not sure Parcells could, because, he felt there was so much value in practicing those guys twice a day. And I think it's one of the reasons that teams get off to slow starts, especially with their offensive lines, is that there's not enough hitting in training camp. Not that I'm a proponent of guys smashing heads against each other in camp. It's really damaging, but there is something to be said for those kind of practices. And I think that's why they're having a lot of these teams are practicing against each other, because it's more like a controlled scrimmage rather than putting him in these preseason games where I think there's a greater chance of being hurt. The hypocrisy of the NFL is what really bothers me now, especially with the commissioner getting up there and saying the safety of our players is our number one priority. You know, they're going to let players wear those padding on the helmets this year that they've had in training camp, because I guess their studies show that it cuts down on concussions. The hits on the quarterbacks have certainly changed. If you breathe on a quarterback now, it's a 15-yard flag. The blindside hits or the defensive players with the receivers, 15-yard flag. And a lot of this has gone a long way to making the game safer. But you can't do that, Patty, and then say, let's change it to 18 games. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And his excuse is, well, you know, who wouldn't rather have 2 preseason games than 3 and 18 regular season games rather than 17? Well, that argument would make sense. And Patty, you know this as well as anybody. These guys don't play in the preseason, so it's not apples to apples. You're not saying, okay, we're going to replace the snaps in a preseason game, and they're going to play in the regular season, so what's the difference? Maybe the starters are playing a quarter of one preseason game now. And some of the quarterbacks don't play at all in the preseason. So you can't be preaching safety and then say, let's play another game, and they're not even talking at this point about adding a second bye week. Do you know how physically, I mean, you know, this is a rhetorical question, how physically taxing it is on these guys to play a Sunday game and play a Thursday game? They're saying, well, our stats don't show that the injury level is any higher. But how many guys playing Sunday don't play Thursday because the recovery time isn't long enough? I mean, what are they doing? I mean, because Christmas is a Wednesday now. Now, the teams that play on Christmas, you know, will play the previous Saturday. And they're saying, well, you know, the time between games is the same as the Sunday-Thursday game. Well, who says that's good? So they're creating more of that? It's all about the money. It's always all about the money. The commissioner is all about the money. He's making $63 million a year, and his responsibility is making more money for the owners. And, you know, all this rhetoric about making the game safer, and that's their priority, doesn't hold any weight with all the other stuff they're doing. And I'm really proud of John Mara, if I can use that expression, for being the one owner who's really stood up and presented pushback to lengthening the season. And I don't know where John stands on the Thursday games, but I would imagine, you know, Giant fans are probably down on John because it's been a long time since they won a Super Bowl. But I really do think he cares. I think he cares about the fans. I think he cares about the players. He's a lot like his dad in that regard. And I would like to see more owners standing up and criticizing the commissioner for some of the things he's done that are strictly intended to make them all more money, as if they're not making enough.
Well said, Gary. Well said. All right. We've got more coming up with Gary Myers. We're going to talk about his latest book, Once a Giant, A Story of Victory, Tragedy, and Life After Football, right after this. Hey, Giant fans. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Not into the NBA or NHL? Then check out the odds for other leagues like MLB, WNBA, PGA, and more. No matter what you're into, you'll find something that matches your interests. And you'll want to be part of all the action, because right now when you sign up for an account with FanDuel, you will get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, with my special guest, Gary Myers, former New York sports writer, now a published author, also a Hall of Fame voter. And Gary has a book out, Once a Giant, A Story of Victory, Tragedy, and Life After Football. And Gary, you know, as you probably know, I wrote a book a couple of years ago myself. And, you know, when you go into the process and you start to hear the stories that these guys tell you, you can't help but get caught up in the emotion, whether it's a story of triumph over tragedy or, a great moment in their career, whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about the emotions you felt as you were, getting into these interviews with these players and coaches, and just how that kind of shaped this whole project for you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I decided I wanted to write this book, this subject, because I feel that, as you can see from our previous segment, I'm really passionate about player safety, and a lot of it has to do that because I've been covering the NFL for so long, back to 1978. I've seen so many of these players grow older, okay, and a lot of the guys who were my age when I started covering them, I see how they are today. And I wanted to write a book about the impact that this game has on these players when they get into their 50s and 60s and early 70s, both from a physical standpoint, financially, emotionally, and most of all, or just as important as anything, is the mental health aspect. And so I decided to write. I wanted to write about one team rather than just talk to a bunch of different players from the era. And the era that I wanted to write about was, the mid to late 80s into the early 90s. And so I had my first 5 books were not about a New York team at all. And I always wanted to do a New York story. So I decided to write about the 86 Giants. They were the perfect age demographic of the players I wanted to write about. They are the most popular of the Giants' 4 Super Bowl teams, and I don't think there's even a question about that. And I already knew a lot of them. So, and yes, it was heartbreaking to listen to Mark Bavaro talk about some of the things that he's been through in his life physically, and then most recently that he had long COVID that had him thinking about taking his own life, because, as he said, his brain was on fire from it, and they think that the virus attacked his brain. He became paranoid, anxiety ridden. For 7 months he lived a miserable existence that it was just really hard to listen to. Bobby Johnson, and let me just say, thankfully, Mark is. I'd say he's probably about 98% right now, and he'd probably say the same thing, that he's doing much better. Bobby Johnson's story, people are aware of. He cut his own career short by his cocaine addiction, and he was a talented player who Phil Simms really trusted. Had that huge play against Minnesota in '86 on 4th and 17 that helped them beat the Vikings. It was the game that a lot of Giants pointed to as saying they became convinced they can win the Super Bowl after they won that game. And Bobby, 3 years after the Super Bowl, Patty, was sleeping on a park bench in Nashville, out of money, cocaine addicted, homeless, would sleep in his mother's apartment every now and then. And to hear his story and how he got himself straightened out to the point that, he had sold the Super Bowl ring for $450 so that he can sleep in a $29 a night hotel, buy some food, and buy cocaine. And, obviously you got through that money really fast. He pawned it for $450, figuring it wouldn't take him long to get that money back and get his ring back. But he blew that money really fast, had no sources of income. And whatever money he was bringing in, he used it to buy more cocaine. So he never got the ring back. And when Parcells and Chris Mara found out about this, and that Bobby had gotten his life turned around, they went and bought the ring back, because it had gone to, first it went to a memorabilia dealer, then it went to a memorabilia Giants, big collector of Giant stuff, who lives on Long Island, and they tracked him down, and they paid the guy $30,000 for the ring. The guy had spent $20,000 for the ring at a Super Bowl when he saw that ring was for sale. So they got the ring, and they made, and Chris made a big presentation to Bobby. So that story was emotional for me to listen to on several levels. One is hearing a guy sleeping on a park bench in Nashville. It was in not a great area of town. It's actually on the site where the Titans Stadium is now, and that area has been cleaned up because the stadium is there. But Bobby got shot at one night by a drug dealer. Somebody's trying to steal his drugs. And so to listen to how he's got his life turned around, and I stay in touch with him. Even after I interviewed him for the book, I call him like once every, 2 or 3 months just to check up on him. And Patty, there's a lot of those kind of stories. Curtis McGriff had a rough go over for a while. Brad Benson is still having a tough time. Harry Carson started a GoFundMe page for Brad. But because I didn't want this book to be 300 pages of really depressing stories, I kind of bounced it off with how this team became a brotherhood as they won a championship together. And unlike a lot of championship teams that do form that bond, this bond has stayed strong nearly 40 years later. And that's a really heartwarming part of the story, is that these guys are there for each other. And I think that, it's one thing that the team stays tight for 5 or 6 years after they win a championship, which I think is very natural. But for that bond to stay the way it is for 40 years, and it is still really strong, I think says a lot about the men on that team.
Yeah, Gary, you raise a good point, because nowadays there's a lot of focus put on mental health. And back then, obviously we didn't have social media. So maybe some of the issues that these guys might have been going through during their playing career and even after, they weren't mainstream. So to go back and to hear about the support system that they formed within each other, you got to think that maybe that support system helped save a few lives on that team.
Yeah, I would listen. Harry Carson is one of my favorite people in the world, and what he's done for some teammates, and a lot of it is so private that even in my honest, raw kind of conversations with Harry, where he's telling me a lot of personal stuff, some of it he just didn't even want to get into, because he's done so much for a lot of his former teammates. And in fact, Harry's so highly regarded around the league that there are players that he doesn't even know, that he never played with, didn't even have a common connection with, who've reached out to him over the years for guidance. And certainly within the Giants community, if a player has a problem, either he or somebody who knows of the problem will call Harry, we'll call George Martin, we'll call Phil Simms. But Harry considers himself captain for life, and he takes that really seriously. And one quick story: Jeff Rutledge, who was the backup quarterback on the '86 team, had a horrific car accident in the early 2000s in Tennessee, and he was lucky to survive it. And Harry was visiting his own relatives in South Carolina. Now, he wasn't really close with Jeff. Backup quarterback and a linebacker, you can't be friends with everybody on the team or close friends, but certainly when you have that bond of being a teammate. So Harry got in his car from Florence, South Carolina, and drove through, I think it's the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'm not good with the geography down there, but he drove from South Carolina through the mountains and just showed up at Rutledge's house in Nashville. And he had heard that Jeff was home from the hospital. And Jeff goes, "What are you doing here?" He goes, "I just had to see for myself that you're okay, so then I can tell everybody else that you're doing all right." And he spent like an hour or two with him, got back in his car, drove the 8 or so hours back to South Carolina, back through the mountains. And Harry just satisfied himself that he checked up on a teammate who meant a lot to him. And now he was able to tell anybody who asked, or maybe he sent out a text chain and just said, "Hey, I just visited Rutledge, and he's doing okay." And that's just the kind of person Harry Carson is. And more people need to know that. And I think through some of the stories that I tell in the book, if you don't know that already about Harry, I think after you read the book, you'll certainly get an idea about why his teammates actually absolutely adore him, because he's there for everybody.
He really is. And he does a lot of work. I think he's involved right now with something with cancer, and, a lot of, I think his son went through some health struggles too, if I'm not mistaken. And you're right, Gary. I got to know Harry as well. and just an amazing human being. And you're right, he does take being a captain for life so seriously.
His son Donald is who you referred to,
Right.
and he had it was called aplastic anemia, I think, which was
Right.
a blood disorder.
Hmm.
When Harry got into the Hall of Fame in 2006, I went down to Savannah, Georgia, which is where Donald was going to school, and I did a story on his relationship with Harry. And Donald had to wear a mask at all times in his apartment. We went out to lunch. He had to wear a mask, and thankfully, Donald is doing great. Donald is now a doctor.
Mm.
He was, at the time I saw him back then, he had told me his plan was hopefully he was going to go to med school. And I always ask Harry about him because he was such a nice guy. And he got through med school, and now I forget where he's a doctor, but Harry's just, immensely proud of him. And I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome, because I remember reading about Donald's health struggles and how concerned Harry was, and I'm glad he made a complete recovery.
Yeah.
Gary, when you were writing this book and you heard the stories, was there anything that kind of jumped out at you that, for as much as you know these guys, having covered them, was there anything that jumped out at you that you just kind of opened your eyes?
Well, and that's a really good question, and I think I have a really good answer to that one, because I'm really close with Phil Simms. I've known him since the day he was drafted in 1979, and even the years I spent in Dallas. I talked to Phil all the time. I had no idea the extent of the back problems he was having as recently as 7-8 years ago, that he was living a miserable existence physically. Because he was in so much pain. He had 2 or 3 back surgeries. It didn't do him any good. He was beside himself. I think it was, say, 2015. He went to a Giant preseason game. He wasn't broadcasting the game. He wasn't going to watch the game. It was strictly to meet with Dr. Warren before the game. And he just needed to find something to help him with his back. And Dr. Warren had said, well, you could have, I need you to come into the city. We'll get you on a plan, a strength plan, or whatever he would have done. And Phil goes, I need immediate relief. I can't do that. I don't have the time. The season's starting. I got a preseason game next week. So he drives home from the stadium back to his house in North Jersey. And he's basically saying, in stronger language than I'm going to give you now, like, but damn, am I going to be one of those players that's just going to be in pain the rest of his life? And he gets back to his house. He flips on the Giant game. He curls up in a ball on his living room floor, trying to take the pressure off of his back. Phil, I don't want to give away too much, but this is just a really compelling story. Phil is not a drinker. His father was an alcoholic, so he knows. He lived in a house with an alcoholic, so he's been very protective of himself in that way. But he was in so much pain, he poured some straight vodka into a glass and chugged it pretty much. And he was also taking some painkillers and then drank another glass of vodka. Not only didn't he feel the effects of the vodka, he didn't feel the effects of the painkiller. So, and we know that's a dangerous combination, is alcohol and painkillers. And here is, Phil Simms, one of the best guys I know, who has never, ever done anything off the field that you would question, but in the privacy of his own home was in such despair and in such pain that he went to that extent to try to deaden the pain. And now, as it turns out, his son Chris, who played in Denver for a while, had turned him on to this, for lack of a better way of describing this person, like a muscle activation doctor, definitely wasn't a chiropractor. Phil tried to explain what kind of doctor he was. I didn't quite grasp it. But Phil, after this incident that I just described to you, flew out to San Diego for a preseason game. And he had maybe met with that doctor once earlier, years earlier. And Chris convinced him to go back. So on his way back from San Diego, he stopped in Denver. And he stayed there for 2 or 3 days. The first time he saw this doctor, the doctor put weight on Phil's hand, like this. And Phil couldn't resist the pressure, and his hand went way down. By the time he left there 4 days later, 3-4 days later, Phil said he could have put a truck on his hand and he could have held it up. Whatever it was that the doctor did, Phil said he saved his life. Because now he never would have. There's 4 players in the book who told me that at some point their level of despair was so great that they at least thought about taking their own life. None of them ever acted on it. And Phil never would have done that. But your mind plays tricks on you. And it was more about how am I going to find a way to manage the rest of my life when I'm in so much pain. I've had surgeries and they haven't worked. I'm sure he did strength exercises and they didn't work. And even when he had that horrible combination of alcohol and painkillers, he didn't feel any relief until he went to this guy in Denver. So as well as I thought I knew Phil, I had no idea about that. And I think other than his immediate family, I'm not sure anybody knew. Even the people at CBS who he was working with every week, and calling games became difficult for him, and flying on airplanes and going through airports became difficult for him. And when CBS mistakenly replaced him in the booth with Tony Romo, in a way it made Phil's life easier, because instead of having to travel every weekend, and this is after he was feeling better physically, he only had to go into the studio in Manhattan on Sundays. So as much as he wanted to continue doing games, I think he realized that doing the studio show was a lot easier on him physically than having to travel every weekend. So, and Phil's doing great now. And there are a lot of sad, emotional stories in my book that fortunately these guys came out the other end of it, and they're doing well today, because these are smart guys who care about their family. They care about themselves, and they knew it was in everybody's best interest for them to seek help, whether it was, medical assistance, with doctors, or whether it was getting themselves the right help for their mental health issues. Curtis McGriff is another one. I'm not going to tell that story, but another one I had no idea about the things that he went through, mainly from concussion issues and the impact that had on his life. And the people who read this book will know about nobody forces players to play, Patty. I mean, it's their choice. But for players from that era, and Harry was very eloquent in the way he expressed this, that nobody told them about the potential damage to their brains. They all knew they can tear an ACL, or they can pop a shoulder, or break an ankle, or whatever. But nobody told them the hits they were taking in games to the head could lead to early Alzheimer's or dementia, or just, really serious mental health issues. A lot of times they were never even diagnosed with having a concussion. It was like they got dinged, or they got their bell rung, and they counted to 5 on the sidelines, and they got put back in the game. At least now there's concussion protocols, because the game is safer in some regards, but for the most part, this is a violent collision sport. It's not a contact sport, it's a collision sport, where you cannot prevent a lot of what's happening, but you can prevent it from getting worse by the proper treatment and care. And whereas players were put back in the game if they can count to 5, those players today you don't see them for the next 3 weeks. And even then, sometimes it's too short a period of time. So times have changed, thankfully, in at least how head injuries are being diagnosed. I mean, there's a bunch of neurologists on the sidelines. There's the spotters in the press box who are looking for players who aren't going to self-report, and they can notice signs where this guy, we got to check this guy for concussion. And I think players have gotten better also, seeing what's happened to some of their predecessors, that there's more self-reporting going on now than ever before.
Gary, I think a big thing your book may accomplish for those who read it is it's a reminder that these guys they're human like you and I and everybody else. And, look, fans have a right to boo and cheer and, do stuff. But there's sometimes that people just take it too far, whether it's, I remember reading there was an incident where somebody showed up at Saquon Barkley's home trying to get him to sign. And sometimes people take it a little too far. But at the end of the day, these are people who, as you said, they make a choice to play this game, which is, takes its toll on you physically, but they're people at the end of the day.
And the thing also to remember is, unlike today, where Daniel Jones is making $40 million a year, players from that era didn't make, I think the most Lawrence Taylor made in the season was either 2.8 or $3 million. The most Phil Simms ever made was, around $2.5 million. And which was a lot compared to, the average person in America back in those years. But the disparity wasn't nearly as great as it is today between the average American and what these football players are making. Not saying that money buys happiness, or when you're 50 years old, if you can't pick up your grandchildren, you can say, well, it doesn't matter because I made $30 million a year doing it. I don't necessarily think it works like that. It makes it easier to play, I would imagine, knowing that you play 3 years in the NFL, even if you're just an average player. If you take care of your money, you're set for life. But players from that era were not set for life. They all had to find other jobs and, find places where they can get health insurance, because back then health insurance was only good for a year and a half after their retirement. And a lot of the major problems didn't happen until they were 40 or 50 years old. And that insurance had ran out a long time ago. And again, unless they bought good health insurance on their own, which can be very expensive, or they had a job that provided good health insurance, that was one of the reasons that a lot of them have had financial problems. And Bill Parcells, which is one thing we haven't talked about, has stepped up. And players who come to him really in financial need, as long as they show to him that they're really in distress, he helps them out. And he's helped out about 20 different players over the years by writing checks for a total of $4 million to his former players to help them out. And that's the side of Parcells. That's another area I would say that I learned by doing my research on this book. I knew Bill had turned to a really compassionate guy, and his former players called him all the time to wish him happy birthday and happy Father's Day. And he would be in touch with the players, and invariably, Patty, the conversations end with them saying to each other, I love you, which is much different than what they said to him in 1986 when he was making him practice twice a day. But Bill has become this really, really compassionate guy. He always cared about his guys. And he can't do anything now about the hard practices he put them through that might have resulted in some of the issues that they're having today, whether it's knees or shoulders or mental health issues. Those hard practices took a toll on those players. And he can't do anything about that to change that today. But the thing he can do is help them out financially if they need it. And he has stepped up in a big way, in a way that I've never heard any other coach do, to help them out if they need it.
It's amazing. It sounds like there's so many great stories in the book. And again, a lot of my listeners, some of my readers, they don't remember the days of Lawrence Taylor and Phil Simms and Bill Parcells. They kind of, they're younger than, a newer generation, if you will. But look, if you are interested in Giant history, make sure you get a copy of Gary's book. I'm available wherever you find books, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Goodreads, wherever you get books. Check it out. Gary, I can't thank you enough for coming on, sharing some of your stories from your book. And of course, talking Giants and Hall of Fame matters and all that stuff. It's always a treat to have you on and to hear your perspective. And I have a lot of respect for you, Gary. You're one of the, not to make you feel, old, because we all know you're not a day over 40, but you were actually one of the columnists that I grew up reading when I was a young aspiring sports writer.
Well, I appreciate your kind words, Patty, and being able to cover the NFL for such an extended period of time has created so many opportunities for me. And really, probably the thing I'm most proud of in my career, the one single thing is this book, because I think it's a really important book. Not only do you learn some Giants history, but you learn about how the players are doing today. And again, that was my motivation for doing the book, because I think it's really something that people need to know about. And I really appreciate you having me on, giving me the opportunity to talk about that and some of the other issues that we talked about. And I want Giant fans to know that I'm going to advocate as strong as I can for Eli, but I only have one of 50 votes. So I'm going to do the best I can to hopefully get people to see it the way that I do. And, I was as critical of Eli as anybody during stretches of his career, because I always felt there was more there. And when you look at the total picture now, I think it's more that the Giants failed him than Eli failed the Giants. Certainly, I think that's how we should look at the Eli era. And we'll see what happens. We'll know sometime in January if he'll be part of the class of 2025.
Hopefully, that would be really neat. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for us on today's Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you again for spending part of your day with us. Thank you to Gary Myers for spending part of his day with us. Make sure you keep it here all week long. We'll have plenty more as we continue our coverage of the OTAs and, of course, the upcoming mandatory minicamp. For Gary Myers, I'm Patricia Traina. Giant fans, we will see you again tomorrow.